The right to vote, which most Canadians take for granted, was a hard-fought battle for Indigenous peoples. In most parts of Canada, Status Indians were offered the right to vote at the time of Confederation, but only if they gave up their treaty rights and Indian status. Unfortunately, few were willing to do this. Métis people were not excluded from voting, as few were covered by treaties, therefore there was nothing to justify disqualifying them. Inuit were also excluded, and no steps were taken to include them since most communities were geographically isolated. So, in the absence of special efforts to enable them to vote, they had no means of exercising the franchise. Long before contact with Europeans, Indigenous peoples had elaborate systems of government. Therefore, many viewed the 19th century proposal for enfranchisement, the granting of the right to vote to citizens, unfavorably for two reasons. First, it would mean that the termination of their recognition of distinct nations or people, as signified by treaties with France, Great Britain, and later Canada, which would mean the beginning of their assimilation into non-Indigenous society. And secondly, it would mean voting in a system of government that was alien to the traditions, conventions, and practices of governance of so many Status Indians. Voting was also considered redundant, as a traditional effective system was already in place for choosing leaders and for governing nations. Proposals to offer the franchise date back to at least 1885, but were met with hostility within the federal government. The status quo endured for nearly a century, as there was little pressure to extend the franchise, although it was extended in 1924 to the Indigenous veterans of the First World War, including on-reserve veterans. The fact that so many Indigenous peoples served with distinction in the Second World War was one of the reasons why it was concluded that the time had come for all Indigenous peoples to have the full rights of citizenship. In 1948, a parliamentary committee recommended that the right to vote be extended to all Indigenous peoples. The federal government did not extend the franchise to limit who did not have treaties or reserves, so were legally considered ordinary citizens, but Status Indians who wanted to vote would still have to waive their right to tax exemptions. Given the significance of this treaty right, few did so. It was not until 1960, under the leadership of Prime Minister John Diefenbaker, that Status Indians were offered the franchise without having to give up any treaty rights in exchange.